welcome to the Kamath Coaching and Consulting Podcast. So welcome to the podcast, Eric. It is a pleasure to have you here. I've been looking forward to this interview for some time now. I'd love to introduce you to my audience. And what I'd like to do is just kind of read a little bit about your background that's on the Adaptive Change Advisors website. Folks, my guest today is Eric Martin. He is Managing Director at Adaptive Change Advisors. Their mission is to democratize leadership, and it draws on Eric's work with Harvard faculty to bring adaptive leadership into widespread application worldwide. Eric is a Detroit native turned prominent leadership expert who has brought leadership development to over 300,000 people in 146 countries. His work extends the framework of adaptive leadership, a somewhat provocative leadership practice developed at Harvard. His work has been published in Fast Company, Stanford Social Innovation Review, Environmental Leader, and a book called Your Leadership Moment by Eric. His work has been used to tackle structural barriers to transitioning into a low-carbon economy, improve health equity and access, and involve the role of advanced technologies like blockchain in our daily lives. Eric serves as board member of the Clean Energy Leadership Institute, a founding board member of the Democratizing Leadership Initiative, an advisory board member of the MAVA Foundation and the American Resilience Project, and a founding member of the MAG Impact Collective. He holds a master in management science in organizational change management and a bachelor's of science in systems analysis and operations research. Previously, he served in a governmental liaison capacity in Japan and at the Synergos Institute, a Rockefeller-affiliated international development organization. So please join me in welcoming Eric Martin to the podcast. Thank you, Eric.
Oh, thanks, Nevin. Thanks for the fulsome introduction. It's rare nowadays in this housebound life that we all live to get that kind of introduction in my daily life. So thank you for that.
Sure. Hopefully started your morning pretty well. I'm wondering, so my first question is, what is missing from this introduction that I just gave you?
Oh gosh, that's funny. The same question was going through my mind as you were reading it. I'm glad you got the point about Detroit. That's many people don't have a relationship to the city of Detroit other than flying through it. But that was such a big part of my upbringing, partly because I grew up during the height of the decline in the city of Detroit, which has been written about and even some movies about. And why that's relevant for me was just this sense of despair and hopelessness that I felt at times, many times actually, growing up in the city. And as a young child, wondering, why doesn't someone do something about this? And I guess that's a theme we can unravel in this conversation perhaps. But that sense that things aren't just right and they could be made better if only people would act is something that I carried with me, I think, throughout my life. And of course, in organizational change work, talent development, leadership development, it's often the case that people sense that something is amiss and they're not quite sure what to do or don't feel like they have the power to make that change happen. So I think for me, that's a big part of the story. And I'm a big fan of Motown music. And back when we used to have good sports teams in the city of Detroit, that was also, a part of my upbringing. So I think that's probably one thing. Mm-hmm.
I remember when the San Antonio Spurs, which is a team that I'm following closely, were playing the Detroit Pistons in the finals for several years. And I know that they were kind of going back and forth. So you guys had some pretty good teams not so long ago, or at least it seems like it wasn't a very long time ago.
Yeah.
Good. So thank you for sharing that. I'd love to kind of get started by getting to know kind of what attracted you to the field of leadership development. It seems like you've been working in the field for quite a long time. Would love to kind of trace, how that interest blossomed and how it grew.
Yeah, I think there's probably a lot of different answers to that. I guess the story that I would typically tell was I was at this Rockefeller affiliated organization that you mentioned in the introduction called Synergos, and we were doing some really cutting edge systems change work around big systems issues like sustainable food supply chains, corporate private partnerships, et cetera, and came across a model of leadership and change that I was intrigued by. And it opened up a career path for me when I realized that change didn't have to be this kind of humdrum change management type approach, project management. Could really get into the deeper questions about life and purpose and meaning in a practical way. So that was, I think that kind of opened the door. And
Hmm.
then I had an opportunity to meet these guys at Harvard, who you alluded to, and discovered this framework of adaptive leadership, which I work with quite extensively. And I can say more about that later on. So, I think in one version of the story, it was just kind of, it was a natural unfolding of a curiosity I had about how do you make real change happen, which again goes back to my upbringing in the city of Detroit. The other version of that story is, well, I was in Japan. I was there for about 5 years. I met a woman from the States, here in the States, but she was working there. And that led me to New York, of all places. I had not planned to go to New York. I had planned to go to LA, actually. And when I was in New York, I met a guy who was actually one of the initial founders of this adaptive leadership work, who happened to be roaming the hallways in a job that I had in the city. He was using the office on a temporary basis. He looked a little bit like he was in the doldrums, and usually pretty, chipper guy. And so I said to him, Alex, what's wrong? And he said, my CFO just quit. Do you know one? And Nevin, it was one of those moments, I'm not sure if you had this before, you probably have, where it was a spur of the moment thing where I said to him, well, why don't you hire me? And he said, well, do you know finance? I said, no, but I'm an engineer. I could figure it out. And so that kind of started the love affair, of getting into the work. And what I wanted to do was to do that systems side. I'm an engineer by training. So I really love systems, Excel spreadsheets, that kind of thing, system optimization. But again, what my real calling was, I think, was to find deeper ways to create change. And I knew from experience that wasn't going to just happen by creating better systems, better policy, or frankly, even having more money. Because at the Rockefeller organization, we had more than enough money and convening power, and still weren't seeing the kind of change in these systems that I think we knew was possible. So I think that's probably, again, there's many different versions of how I ended up here, but I think that's probably the ones that are alive for me today.
Interesting. Yeah, we all have different stories about how we got into the work we're passionate about. So love to hear it. What is leadership to you, Eric? How do you think about leadership, and what exemplifies qualities of leadership to you?
What is leadership? There's probably 170 different theories and models and frameworks of leadership out there. So it's a good question. There's two schools of leadership, roughly speaking. There's what's called the great person theory of leadership, which is about charisma, vision, all these attributes that we typically associate with leadership, influence, power. And while it's called the great person theory of leadership, to be honest, I think most of the examples and books that are written about it, you could probably call the great white man theory of leadership. It's a very one-dimensional view of leadership. And that's kind of served a purpose, I guess, for a while. But I'm in a different school, which is leadership as a behavior. It's something that you do. It's not something that you are. Charisma, vision, those things have a place. There are tools, there are resources for leadership, but they really have nothing to do with leadership itself, which I would say for me is about mobilizing people to tackle challenges that have no answers, or no known answers, or no easy answers. So it's the act of actually bringing people to work on things that they'd rather not work on, or they don't know how to work on. And those kind of issues, which we have a name for, we call those adaptive problems, adaptive challenges, adaptive problems. They're everywhere, So you look at organizational culture change is something that many people in talent development focus on. That's an adaptive kind of challenge. Big social issues like, say, climate change or racial equity. These are adaptive challenges, meaning that there is no known answer. And even the problem itself is often unclear. Depending on who you ask, some people might not even say there is a problem. Others will have different definitions of the problem. So this act of how do you bring people together to work on something that doesn't even have a clear problem definition, much less a solution, and bringing them back together over time to discover a solution to that is an act of leadership. And for me, it's the most noble act of leadership. So that's probably one definition I would offer for my view of what leadership is. And there's many good examples. Some are historic, people that have led big movements, people who have shifted organizations through big market changes. So there's plenty of examples, but I hesitate to share them because, again, I don't want to pigeonhole the idea of what a leader is in people's minds. In fact, I never use the word leader, right? Which is kind of ironic. In leadership development, I never say the word leader. I'll talk about exercising leadership, the act of leadership. But to me, that's very different from the person. Yeah.
Interesting. So leadership is a verb as opposed to a noun. That's wonderful. So in my understanding, adaptive leadership separates challenges that one faces into different categories of challenges. You've got technical challenges, and then in the middle, you've got technical/adaptive challenges, and then I think you've got adaptive challenges. Can you explain to our listeners what is the difference between these types of challenges, and is that a good starting point to talk about adaptive leadership?
I think it's a good one. I think it's a very practical idea, because most people make the mistake of conflating technical problems and adaptive problems, and that results in probably the biggest waste of resources and time in organizational life. So what is a technical problem? I mean, a very simple example would be a broken arm. There's no debating what the problem is. There's no need to mobilize people or to get into deeper systemic root cause analyses. It's the arm used to go straight this way, now it's going at a 90-degree angle, clear problem, and the solution is also very clear. And there's an expert that you can hire, or if a doctor yourself, you can do the work yourself. So that's a technical problem. An adaptive problem is very different. And let me just use the metaphor of Detroit again, or the reality of Detroit. My dad was a firefighter in the city of Detroit, again, during the height of its decline. And of course, the technical work of a firefighter is to put out fires. And there's a known procedure, protocol, best practice, and it's life-saving work. Technical work is very important. That's what he did most of the time. But in the mid-'80s, when we began to experience a lot of arson in the city, you have to ask yourself, what's the source of the arson? What's the cause of the arson? And the correct answer there is not the arsonists. You have to look at some of the conditions that are giving rise to arson, be it people having to warm their homes because they have no heat. So they're using fire logs and wood burn fire. Maybe it's the destitution. Maybe in many cases actually it was the decay in the neighborhoods that gave rise to prostitution, drug dealing, which would happen in these abandoned homes, which then would be set on fire, either purposely or not. So in other words, a lot of work, the work required to solve the quote unquote arson problem in the city wasn't just about putting out fires faster. I mean, that's what they did. And it wasn't just about, taking your known expertise and protocols and making them more efficient, which is often how we approach adaptive problems. Let's just do what we're already doing, but do it faster, more efficiently, or louder. Louder meaning let's do it with more gusto, with more data at our disposal. So you can think about, in that kind of situation, my father, very technically oriented, a very authoritative leader, because that's how these hierarchical systems work, is faced with this adaptive challenge. So now what kind of choices he faced to mobilize the other firefighters to tackle that challenge, to think of themselves in some ways as community relations specialists,
right.
Not just firefighters. So to me, that's a very poignant example. And of course, the analogy there extends to the workplace, where we're constantly putting out fires in the workplace, customer service complaints, low employee morale. And more often than not, we could reel off a list of ways people do that. They do it technically, rather than looking at the underlying conditions that are giving rise to those kinds of things. So for me, that is a really good entry point. And once we begin to see the distinction between technical work and adaptive work, it raises the immediate question, well, whose work is it? And how do you actually solve that? And how do I need to deploy myself if I have authority, if I'm the boss, or if I don't have authority? And that's where this question of leadership really comes into play.
So that's a great segue into my next question. I don't mean to pepper you with questions. I'm so curious about adaptive leadership. It's such a fascinating theory. Now, you gave a really good example of your father as kind of a manager and a leader of firefighters dealing with an adaptive problem. Now, my question is, what are the leadership practices or the behaviors, as you might say, that exemplify adaptive leadership? Now that we've kind of framed the problem, how do adaptive leaders act in an adaptive way?
Yeah, these are great questions, Nevin. I appreciate it. And they're deep questions, right? So it's hard to give a menu or a checklist for how you approach these kind of things. But generally speaking, I would say, first of all, is to see the problem for what it is. And that often is, you mentioned we frame the problem here. The framing often doesn't happen, or it gets framed in a way that is very technical. So the first step is to get some perspective. And in the adaptive leadership literature, we have this practice called getting on the balcony. So that's the idea of getting perspective in the midst of action. If you can imagine being at a dance, when we used to be able to dance together before COVID, and you most of the time you're on the dance floor. You're trying to stay out of people's way, or trying to find a partner, or try not to step on somebody's toes, or what have you. But if you get perspective, you might be able to see who's dancing with who, and is the music too loud? Is that why people are way over here instead of, by the front? And so you see the patterns, and part of the work of leadership adaptive leadership is to actually see the problem for what it is, to see that it's adaptive, not just technical. Having done that, half the work is just to get people's attention on that issue, because people are rewarded for doing technical work. They're rewarded for checking the box, for hitting their quarterly targets, etc. And because adaptive work takes time, there's a huge tendency for people to get distracted or to displace responsibility for doing it onto others, including consultants. I think most consultants actually make most of their money applying technical fixes to adaptive problems. And then when they don't get solved, we either blame the consultant or we say, well, we hired them and they couldn't solve it, so what can we do? So I think that's step one. Step two is to frame it and keep attention. And then when people begin to engage in this work, it will generate conflict. So imagine any kind of adaptive challenge you want, even using the firefighter example. If my father were to if he had said to his fellow firefighters that we're now doing community relations work, oh, and by the way, we need to address our own racism, which is giving rise to antagonism in the neighborhood. I mean, you can imagine that's not going to be received very well. Yeah. So a lot of the work of adaptive leadership is orchestrating that conflict. It's not about creating conflict, but the conflict will naturally emerge when you begin to raise these tougher questions. So if you're the kind of person, as I am, an engineer by training, or someone who really likes to problem solve, have answers, that old adage, come to me with solutions, not problems, I think is entirely off base when it comes to leadership. Because again, the problems need to be defined, the solutions need to be discovered. So the best we can do oftentimes is ask the hard questions and then hold people's attention as they try to escape that, or hopefully over time wrestle with the answers to those questions. So the next step then, beyond orchestrating that disequilibrium and conflict, is to then create a space where people can try different things. Let's try doing this. Let's see if this works. And there's a whole wealth of information around rapid cycle prototyping, human-centered design, a lot of stuff out there nowadays about how you would actually do that kind of experimentation, iterative learning type process. And that's really core to adaptive work as well. I think the other part, and this is the part that I think people find most profound and most meaningful, but also hardest to describe when they engage in adaptive leadership, is the personal change that they experience. So when you begin to see these adaptive challenges in your life, and it could be at work or it could be in your civic life or even at home, it just changes how you see the world, and there's so many examples right now with the political election ramping up in the United States here of, politicians promising technical fixes to fundamentally adaptive challenges like immigration, for example. So when you see these challenges, you really understand yourself differently. You understand your work differently. And so people go through a pretty profound shift as they think about the kind of work that they're capable of doing and that they really want to be doing. That deep personal change, that personal adaptive change to me is, I wouldn't say the final step of this process. It's kind of imbued throughout. But that's where the leadership development happens. Because with this way of thinking about leadership, anyone can lead, right? Different constraints, different resources, but you don't have to be the boss to see the problem. You don't have to be the boss to be able to, work with people to define the problem and engage in it. Yes, being the boss has resources, but also has huge constraints, because even the boss or the CEO often is not expected to do adaptive work. And so in fact, most leadership doesn't happen by people at the top. That's probably the least likely place for it to happen. So that raises the whole question about leadership without authority. So I think those are, again, I don't want to call those steps, but those are key ingredients. And they're really questions to ask. What's the work, technical and adaptive? Whose work is it? It's never yours alone. What's your leadership moment? So what's a risk or a step you can take that might be outside of what people expect? And then what are you really willing to change or let go of even as you embark on this kind of way of thinking about leadership and change?
Now, you mentioned leadership moment, and I know that I think in reading some about your background, you write a little bit about like the leadership moments that people have during their day. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about what is a leadership moment and why is it important for individuals to think about those moments and to seize those opportunities.
Yeah, what is a leadership moment? Probably, let me describe it in a way that has more of a kind of a visceral feel to it. So they're moments that make your heart leap. It could be with hopeful anticipation, or it could be with fear of taking that next step. There are moments that seem to hold the promise for a long-awaited breakthrough. Or as I like to say, and this is paraphrasing something that a guy named Charles Eisenstein often says, but they're moments that call and kind of reveal to us the more beautiful world that our heart knows is possible, to coin his phrase. So they're moments that hold uncomfortable possibility, and that possibility includes potentially you too need to change, as I said. So, people who engage in leadership moments are speaking up, they're standing up. Sometimes they're taking a knee in a form of patriotic protest. They're asking questions no one else will ask. And even in normal times, this is the case much more so in these times of uncertainty. So that's kind of the texture of a leadership moment, and they're everywhere. I can't watch even a movie or or listen to a podcast sometimes without thinking about the step beyond the known, the step beyond the comfort, the step beyond the expected that people take in the service of a purpose, not because they want to be uncomfortable or want to make others uncomfortable, but because the moment calls for that kind of questioning. So that's kind of the texture of a leadership moment. And in the book, I do write about three examples, really kind of longitudinal examples of people who have engaged in leadership moments over many years to create deep change in their organizations and in society. So, so I can say more about that, but that's kind of, for me, what it feels like. And
Interesting.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about your book, because I mentioned one book in the biography at the introduction, but I think you're writing another book, or you're releasing another book soon. Am I right?
Yeah, well, the book that I'm focused on now it's called Your Leadership Moment, and the subtitle is a mouthful, but it's Democratizing Leadership in an Age of Authoritarianism.
Excellent.
So it's this idea that we look to authority oftentimes in moments of trouble or uncertainty or transition like we're experiencing right now all around the world. And again, authority is probably the last place that we're going to see this kind of leadership that I'm talking about. So democratizing leadership is the idea of both providing these tools of leadership to people around the world, regardless of their identity or history or access to financial power and capital. But it's also this kind of skill set of democracy, not the big D democracy, but the kind of the work of holding people through a period of conflict as they work through legitimate systemic conflict together. So that's kind of the second meaning of democratizing leadership. The book itself is it's a bit of a distillation and expansion of adaptive leadership, which is this framework that I work with, which you mentioned, that came out of Harvard Kennedy School about 35 years ago. And what I do is follow the stories of three people who I've worked with extensively in the past. One is a clean energy executive who is trying to shift the energy sector to be cleaner, coming from West Virginia, which is not known for its progressive energy policy in general. So again, think about leadership and what it means to mobilize people when they don't even agree with you on the problem, much less the solution. So that's one example. I work also with a woman who is, I don't want to say fighting, but she's advocating for LGBTQ plus rights within a fascinating organization that it's a faith-based organization, which makes her challenge that much more difficult. And she's been mobilizing people for years to move that agenda forward. And then the third person is a young, I would say young, he's in his 30s, from India, and he's from the lowest caste in India. So if your viewers know about the caste system, you have people at the top, and it's a very rigid system, and people at the bottom who are called Dalits, or they used to be called untouchables. And within the Dalit caste, he's the lowest. His caste is the lowest within that. They sweep the streets, they pick up garbage, they have to go into sewers oftentimes, and he's leading a social justice movement in India, which is just remarkable. So I kind of, through telling their stories against the backdrop of my own story in Detroit, bring to life these ideas of adaptive leadership in a way that I hope anyone can apply and relate to. And so that's kind of the book, and it's really been a real adaptive change process for me to write it, because I think I had to come to terms with some of my own obstacles in life as I wrote about what I grew up with, including the racism in my own family. So yeah, so it's been quite a journey, I think, as many books are, and we'll see. It comes out in October of 2020, so we'll see how well it's received.
Excellent. Yeah, I'll definitely be looking out for it. Maybe you can tell us now. It's like I feel like you're giving me little nuggets, and I want to keep pulling each thread that you give me. So I apologize for that, but maybe you can tell us a little bit about the challenges that you've overcome, whether it's in writing this book or in other situations that have made you and strengthened your leadership capacity and your abilities.
Yeah, gosh, there's so many, Nevin, and some are more relevant to the moment than not. Again, struggling with the racism that I grew up with, and coming to terms with my own white privilege. The idea of whiteness, that's something I'm continually working on right now, and that could be a whole different conversation for us, perhaps. But that's something that's really ongoing for me, and what I'm discovering through that process is that adaptive change at some level gets to identity change. So let me see what I mean by that. Now, actually, let me give you an example. I did a workshop, a 2-day leadership workshop for professionals who do early childhood development, and wasn't doing my normal thing, but what I've been doing for decades, or at least 15 years, and generally it works in the sense of helping people internalize these ideas in a deep, meaningful way. Within, I don't know, 4 hours of doing this workshop, one of the participants, in a moment of leadership, I would say, a leadership moment, stood up and said, I don't want to listen to you anymore. Because,
Wow.
yeah. And now I should say, people often say that because, I'm often poking and kind of prodding and provoking, some of their assumptions around what leadership is and the relationship to authority and technical versus adaptive. So it's a common reaction for people to kind of push back on these ideas and personalize that in me, which is often what we do to people who represent leadership, right? Is we make it about them. So that dynamic is very alive and is actually part of the curriculum in these sessions that I do. But this was different. This was very different. He wasn't taking issue with what I was saying. He was taking issue with what I was. And he said, I don't want to listen to you anymore because you are racist.
Wow.
It really shocked me. And the fact that it shocked me alone tells you how ignorant I was and still am in many ways. And we wrestled with this, and to his credit and the group's credit, for 2 days, and it wasn't clear we were going to make it through. And there were times in that conversation, and I'm getting to this obstacle question you're asking. There were times in that conversation over 2 days where I felt so bad that I just wanted to say, gosh, you don't know who I am. Like, if you knew Eric, the father of 3, doing a lot of work in the world with people in different conditions, you wouldn't think so poorly of me. That's what I wanted to say. Of course, I didn't say that. But what I realized through that process is that when it comes to race as an adaptive challenge, the personal experience of that, coming from a white person's point of view, or a person who considers himself to be white, the personal experience of that is not about race. It's about, gosh, I can't be me. If you only knew me, why don't you just let me be me? Which of course mirrors, right, what many people in marginalized communities feel on a daily basis, that they can't be themselves. So in a way, it's not a surprise I'd be feeling that. But then it goes a step further, which is the sense that in order to engage, in order to relate, in order to be useful, to be relevant in that kind of circumstance, I have to be willing to let go of a part of who I think I am. That good guy part of me, or whatever it might be. I need to be willing to have my identity informed by the people I'm working with. That's hard. And I realize that's the giving over of power. At least that's one form of giving over power. It isn't to empower people. It isn't to hand over the mic. It's to actually be willing to say that who I am as a person, this identity I've constructed, or that's been constructed by others over a lifetime, is good, yes, but also needs to be left behind. And one of the hardest parts of adaptive change is not the change per se. It's the loss. That's what we resist, the idea that we have to give something up. Comfort, routine, power, control, etc. But in my case, in this example, it was giving up a sense of who I am, my identity, in that room so that I could become something that was more useful and less racist. So that was a pretty deep, profound change. And I began to see that the kind of systems change work that I've been doing for years had to, and in its best days, did include this deeper adaptive change. Call it identity change, call it whatever you want, but it's really getting to the core of what a system is, because a system is not a system. It doesn't exist outside of us. It's just us. It's just people who agree to do certain things in a social construct, a Rousseauian social construct, until we stop agreeing to do that. And while that might sound a little bit ethereal and academic, we're seeing it happen right now with COVID, where all these social norms around work, we're working from home, working not from home, mask wearing, social distancing, etc. These are things that were inconceivable only a year ago. And now that whole social construct has shifted, albeit because of an emergency, a pandemic, and the fear around that. But we can reconstruct these social norms in a deep, meaningful way. And so to me, that is a key part of what I've learned through this very personal experience. And I thank the young man who said that to me, because it really did cascade into a lot of revelations and questions that remain to this day.
Hmm. Very interesting moment. Thank you for sharing that. This kind of brings me to want to ask you a little bit about what's going on in the country today. COVID, the murder of George Floyd, and climate change. There's so many challenges and crises that we're facing at a macro level with things like climate change, like a slow moving wave that I think all of us are just afraid of embracing and understanding. And then we've got COVID, we're dealing with it on a very daily basis. We're dealing with disruptions in our lives. What does adaptive leadership have to say about these particular challenges, Eric?
It's a great question, Evan. Well, let me speak first about COVID and try to connect to this question around leadership and change. I think what COVID is doing is it's bringing into sharp relief the path that we've already been on. So some people say that COVID changes everything. And actually, I don't see anything in our response to COVID that is actually very new. It's just an intensification, an acceleration of existing trends, things like surveillance, tracking, distancing, digitization, the indoorization of entertainment, recreation, sociality. Like, none of this is new. We've been on this path for a long time. And in fact, have embraced this path for the most part. And when I say we, I mean kind of the dominant culture that controls corporations, media, the narrative. We've embraced this path. We've called this progress. This is technological progress. This is economic development. In fact, we say that countries around the world should aspire to this, right? This is what grows GDP. This is the holy grail. I mean, that's kind of been the mindset for decades. And so here COVID comes along and reveals to us in really sharp relief the path that we've been on. And in great extreme, I don't know when's the last time you've been out, but it's been a long time for me traveling, right? So we are experiencing in extreme relief right now what it would feel like to keep on the path that we're going down, which is more and more separation from each other, separation from nature, separation from the workplace, separation from ourselves, frankly. I mean, there's so much that doesn't get encoded in the data stream of this Zoom call we're on right now that we could just forget. And in fact, the economic system itself is going to re-gear itself so that this becomes normal, obvious, useful, productive, profitable, even more than it already is. So to me, that one of the fundamental adaptive challenges that COVID is just an example of is this separation that's being created. And we can go in many different directions with that point. Looking at employee morale, looking at what it takes to do true human capital development. And I don't even like the word human capital. Again, it implies that we are just a bunch of stuff, a bunch of raw materials that can be, sustainably depleted. Same thing with sustainability. We talk about sustainability, corporate sustainability, environmental sustainability. That's not really about sustainability. That's about the sustainable depletion of the Earth's natural resources, right? So what are we trying to sustain is the question I'm posing here. And I don't think it's the path that we've been on. Now, I'm not saying throw everything away. Of course, you can't do that. But you can begin to question the deeper assumptions, narratives, myths even, that have kind of unconsciously told us who we are, what our roles are, what the meaning of work is, what the meaning of life is, etc. So for me, this is the most fundamental kind of question that's being raised by COVID. And then the question is, what do you do in response to that? And I wish there was an answer, you're right, a formulaic answer. If you're in this condition, you should do that. If you're a CEO, you should do that. If you're an activist, you should do that. But it's really contextual. And I think that choice that people can face in their day-to-day life goes back to some of the principles of adaptive leadership we've been talking about. What's the work? What's the problem? Whose work is it? What's your choice in this moment? What's the change you need to engage in? Those kinds of questions are really helpful to navigate the uncertainty. So I don't know if that's kind of too much of a, I don't know if that's an 80,000 foot view of, the situation from one point of view, from my point of view, but to me, that is really what COVID represents. And we have a choice. We're not going to go back to normal automatically, because the nature of authoritative systems and authority is to protect people. That's what authority wants to do. I want to protect you. And that's actually how people in authority hold on to their authority. I'm going to protect your job, protect your sense of competence, protect your identity, protect your resources, protect your borders, right? And so the tendency of power in this kind of uncertainty is to gain more power through the provision of protection to people, which we want. So long as we are actually in that game with people in power, we're actually giving over our own agency, our own power. So we're all complicit in this, I guess is what I'm saying. And it's up to us to make those individual choices to change the game. This is
excellent. Very interesting. Now, let me pose to you kind of a question about incorporating these leadership practices into one's own kind of practice as a leader, as a manager, director, VP, C-level executive. These tough situations that arise when you're managing, like just for example, handling conflict between employees or persuading an employee to stay or firing an underperforming employee. Maybe we can take just one of those, like just firing an underperforming employee. And I do like to ask this to my guests from time to time. How would you do that as an adaptive leader? Would you consider that an adaptive challenge, or is that more of a technical challenge that you would, you kind of follow a routine and you do it according to kind of the book?
Yeah, no, I appreciate making it really practical in this call too. That's good to kind of toggle back and forth on that. So I'll give you an answer. I hope it's satisfactory, but it may not entirely be so. So there is an adaptive part to that work of firing an employee, and what that might look like, depending on the situation, is to be mindful that when you fire somebody, whenever you're going through adaptive change, where there's some loss, sometimes that loss is people, right? So as you're losing people, you need to be mindful of the people who will be left behind, who are watching them, who care more about that person than they do about your reason for firing them or the change process, the transformation process you're going through. So a very practical, adaptive kind of leadership practice in that kind of situation is to treat the person well on their way out the door, which kind of flies in the face of corporate policy sometimes. HR policy often says, get them out the door before they can steal our IP, before we risk a lawsuit. Maybe do an exit interview, but that's it. That's very different than what I'm talking about, which is treating them well ethically because they probably deserve it, but also strategically because the people who are watching how they're treated, who are still left in the organization, will be gauging how much they want to get on your next change initiative based on how you treat that person. So that's a very kind of practical piece. But to be honest, if I were posed that question by an executive, putting on my adaptive leadership hat, I wouldn't answer the question the way I just did. I would say, why is the person leaving? Why were they not performing? What is it about the conditions of the company that hired someone like that, or that, whether they were capable or not, didn't cultivate their talents and gifts? That is probably where some of the adaptive challenge actually lies. So we can get better at firing people, or we can get better at developing people, keeping people. And to me, that is, where the work probably lies. And that's where people in authority, like the person who might be asking this question, become complicit and have to change their own behavior. So I'll give you an example to me which is really, really illustrative. And this has to do with Patagonia, which to me is one of the best companies when it comes to doing adaptive work and adaptive leadership in the world, not just within the company. And their CHRO, a guy named Dean Carter, when he came on board, I think about 5-6 years ago, really dug into the performance management process because he recognized it as an adaptive process. And what they discovered is that people felt really good about their jobs throughout the year. And then they had to have a performance review conversation, which the employee hated, the manager hated, and frankly, everyone had to recover from during the next business cycle. There's actually a lot of science that shows that people literally feel depleted at the end of a performance review process, and then companies have to spend a lot of money just to recover. It's expensive. It's also damaging to their human dignity. And that's because we often treat talent development or human capital development as capital, as resources, as I was saying a moment ago. So what they did, rather than doing the usual annual engagement survey, or what Dean Carter called the annual extraction survey, they flipped it on its head. And they said, do we have HR processes that are regenerative in nature? Right? And this gets to issues of climate change, sustainability as well, but this idea of regenerativity is core. And they said, okay, what are we putting into employees' lives? Do they have a healthier relationship with their spouse? Do they have more quality time with their kids? Do they have time to go to the doctor when they're sick? Are they better able to contribute to their community? In fact, they give their employees, I think, a month a year to volunteer for a nonprofit, environmental nonprofit of their choice, fully paid. So are they doing that? And in every case, they found that if they were putting things into people's lives, that their engagement and morale also improved. And there was, it didn't change productivity so much, but they had much happier people. So this is what happens when you begin to reframe the problem and start treating people, in this case, with a regenerative approach versus an extractive one. And it triggers a whole different way of working together, but also a new line of inquiry into the business. So the mission of Patagonia recently shifted about a year or two ago, reflecting this growing awareness that the people, neither the people nor the natural world are just a bunch of raw materials, just a bunch of instrumental stuff, a pile of resources devoid of meaning in life that they can exploit. And they've launched a new mission, which I think is really exciting, I think the mission, if I can state it correctly, is to save our home planet. So quite bold for a clothing company to say they're now in the mission of saving our home planet. And the kind of adaptive changes they'll have to institute as a company to make that happen are quite profound. So you need leadership across all levels of the organization, not just at the very top. So I hope that's a useful example of how you might kind of take this employee morale type issue or employee performance issue and reframe it in a meaningful way to be much more strategic.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of getting towards the close of the interview, wanted to just ask, what books or resources would you recommend to people who are interested in adaptive leadership? Not including your book, of course, but books that you might recommend for people kind of getting into this topic. And maybe your book is a good place to start, but I'm wondering what kind of resources you'd suggest.
Well, there's a whole literature, a whole library of adaptive leadership books out there. I probably have a few back here. So depending on your liking, the very academic one, which is seminal, is called Leadership Without Easy Answers by Ronald Heifetz. Great book. It's very thick and dense, but actually I like that one. There's another book called Leadership on the Line, which is more conversational. There's a book called The Practice of Adaptive Leadership, which is kind of a field book, not quite, very long, but very comprehensive. So there's a lot in the adaptive leadership literature, both on the content as well as the pedagogy. So depending on what people like, you can go deeper on that. There's also some great books. They're a bit old now. I have it here. I just saw it. This book is called Presence by Joe Jaworski, Peter Senge, who you might recognize, Otto Scharmer, who's a genius of a guy up at MIT, and Betty Sue Flowers. And this has a particular process that they work with called the U process, which gets to these deeper levels of change. In fact, that process for leadership and change is the one that I was referring to earlier on in this call. When I was talking about my experience at the Rockefeller Organization doing deep change work, it really came from this book, which really inspired me. That's a good one. Immunity to Change is a great book by Bob Keegan and Lisa Leahy, which talks about individual organizational change as well. They have a new book called Deliberately Developmental Organizations, which I'd recommend. And then lastly, I would say, if I have it here, there's a book, here we go. There's a series of books by this guy, Charles Eisenstein, called this one's called Sacred Economics, which takes, a very adaptive view into economics, political science, the environment, and pretty much every kind of system you can imagine, every kind of institution you can imagine on the planet. This guy's about 200 years ahead of his time, I think. Some of the stuff's really out there. It's not for everyone. I'll say that up front. But there's a really profound way that he frames issues and does so in a way with language that itself doesn't embed the very problem he's trying to solve. The way he uses language actually begins to shift the framing just by the choice of language. And what I find most people who try to solve adaptive problems do so with solutions that encode the very problem they're trying to solve. It's just it's this endless circle. So he does a great job of breaking that circle. Lots of stuff out there. Like I said, 170 different leadership models and theories, so no shortage. And that's been probably part of my work is to curate that for myself so I can help others.
Excellent. Any final thoughts that you'd like to share with the audience today, Eric, before we go? Yeah.
Gosh, there's so much. I really just appreciate this conversation, Nevin. This is really opening up, new lines of inquiry for me. So I guess I don't know if I'm trying to think how this is going to be useful for people as they formulate their own, HR policy, talent development policy, leadership policy. And I guess if I was going to make that bridge based on what we've been talking about, I'd say let's put a bit more attention to the health of the person as a whole. And I know this is a part of it already, but even more, how do you transition back post-COVID to a more holistic, regenerative human system compared to where we are right now? Because I think once we understand that corporate wellness and social wellness, relational wellness, political wellness, spiritual, ecological wellness, they're all part of the same wellness, then the scope of our allowable action will broaden. And so, how do you do that, Eric, I guess? Well, I think the simple question is to ask, what is calling to my care? What is mine to do right now? What's my leadership moment? And, resist the urge to to answer that question with technical solutions, more development policy, or more assessments, more quantitative reasoning. That has a place as well. But to extend quantitative reasoning and financial incentives into the realm of human development, I think is not going to take us to a better place in taking care of our people. So I think the invitation I would offer to people is perhaps to come into more intimate relationship with themselves, with each other, having been locked away from each other for so long. And let's not let lockdown slip into getting locked back into old ways of doing things. So it's, more intimate relationship with place, with, the garden outside, with work. I think that's how deep the revolution is that's being offered to us by COVID. And to look at each other and be able to say that, that feeling I always had, it's true. That we do actually need each other, that we actually are in this thing together, and that my life is richer because you exist. Like, if we can genuinely say that, a lot of these questions, I think, become, easier to tackle together. So it's a bit pie in the sky, perhaps a bit utopian, but why not shoot high, man? It's rare that we get an opportunity to reset like we have, this year.
For sure, man, for sure. Well, thanks so much, Eric. This has been a really enjoyable conversation, and, really appreciate you joining us for this interview. Wish you the best. I'll be checking out your book. It's called, tell us again what it's called.
Your Leadership Moment.
Okay, excellent. I'll be checking that out. Thank you so much, Eric. Really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, thanks, Nevin. Really great meeting you, and I look forward to having future conversations.
Thank you for listening to the Kamath Coaching and Consulting Podcast.